My name's Pesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global. In 2021, 740 million women around the world lacked access to banking services. That's around 20% of all women. And just 15% of firms that trade across borders are led by women, and women-owned businesses contribute the largest proportion of the oft-cited trade finance gap, and it's even worse for those women in emerging and developing markets. This is a problem that often starts from a junior level. Today, we're discussing this in more detail, and I'm delighted to be joined by Rita King, Managing Director, Head of Institutional Trade Sales at Lloyds Bank, live streaming from Sibos, held in Beijing. Rita, welcome to Trade Finance Talks.
Thanks, Dipesh. Great to be here.
Good to have you as well. So, quick introduction. Who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
Sure. So, Rita King. I head up the trade sales team at Lloyds Bank, covering our institutional client bases, so our FIs and also our non-bank FI clients from a trade and working capital perspective. I started my career on the graduate programme, but really for the last 10 years or so, I've been within the trade space. So I guess a key point for me is it's given me that breadth and stretch to grow throughout that time through junior levels to the position I'm in now. And I'm incredibly passionate, not just about trade as a subject and the opportunity and the developments in the area, but supporting other females come through and providing those opportunities.
Thank you very much. And actually, it would be good for us to talk about that throughout this interview. Let's start with the trade finance related question with regards to that gender gap.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of challenges, but can you talk about what you think are the biggest challenges where we need to prioritize when it comes to actually providing female-owned businesses access to trade finance?
Sure, absolutely. So listen, as you touched on at the start, the stats are quite shocking. 15% of global exporting firms are female-led. It's so small, right? And when you look into some of the studies and some of the verbatim feedback around what are the key challenges to that, two things are really cited, first and foremost. One, the lack of access to collateral, which is typically required when looking at financing. And that's particularly an issue for smaller, medium-sized firms, which often are the female-led startups, new firms building their base. And secondly, there's a wider piece around a knowledge gap that's perceived, especially around female-led firms, on actually what trade finance can do, what the instruments do, and how they can then access leverage to finance. So I think, if we focus in on those two pieces, the collateral piece, first and foremost, I think if you look and you talked about emerging markets, but Africa as an example, I think something in the region of 90% of the commercial banks there cited lack of collateral being the main reason for rejecting trade finance applications. So I think there's a huge opportunity as we look to tech and we look to the digital agenda around, okay, how can we use data, big data and AI really to be a catalyst for change around the insights that we can actually look at transactional behaviours and some of the financial backgrounds of these female-led entrepreneurships to actually bridge the gap where the collateral may not be there. They may not physically have the means or the assets as they start off to provide that. So I think that's a really interesting piece. And then secondly, when I look at the knowledge piece, I think there's a role we can play as industry leaders to address that in general, actually, to, demystify trade somewhat and really get to grips in working capital terms, in real life business terms, around the solutions we provide, how those are changing, and how they can support with financing, whether that be risk mitigation and or working capital. So I think those are the two key challenges I see, and therefore the two areas that we should really hone in on when we look at how we're going to try and shift this.
Thank you. It's a really good point, and actually we were in Barcelona with the International Finance Corporation a few months ago, and they launched the report Banking on Women who trade across borders, and those two were cited, that lack of collateral. What can we do as banks, as the trade finance community, to perhaps address that problem using tech, using data, using different ways of monitoring risk, and then the knowledge gap. So there's the idea that, what we do as an industry is considered as quite complicated, and that's a barrier for particularly for women to enter into the sector. Let's talk about the knowledge part. And I think it starts at a young age, and it starts when you are early on in your career. And I think you're a very good example as someone who's kind of come through that system, the graduate program, and you've excelled in your career. I want to ask you about mentorship. What would you say it takes to be a female role model in banking, and how can trade organisations such as Lloyds Bank, but also wider organisations or trade associations, actually create some of those mentoring opportunities? Sure.
So I think first and foremost, lead by example, right? And I think there's a huge amount to be said, actually, and personally, when I reflect, this played a massive part in my career development. I've seen senior female role models, just to know that actually it is possible, right? And that beyond a certain point you can get there, and that actually you can balance real life logistics around the work-life balance, but also by showing that it is possible, right? I really think that drives ambition and drive in those junior members of staff that are coming through the ranks. And I think it's super important that as senior females, we provide that example, that we engage with, and that be twofold, actually, when I look at mentoring. So mentoring has played a big part, certainly in my career so far. I've been lucky enough to have some wonderful mentors, both male and female, throughout my career, who, I've taken a lot at different junctures around learning from their experience, reflecting on things, looking at the way I approach certain situations, and perhaps how I can change and develop actually to move into leadership roles and transition from, in my case, a purely sales role through to a leadership and a people management role. But I also think that there's a huge part in reverse mentoring. And I think that's massively important, because I think, and this is across, gender, I think giving a platform for senior leaders to hear the experiences, the challenges, the perceptions, and quite frankly, learn from junior members of staff as well as the flip reverse, is hugely important, right? Because how are we going to progress and engage with our teams and understand what drives them, especially when you look at generational differences as well? Things are changing. The speed of change has never been as much in the industry, certainly in the teams that I've worked in, as it is, over the last few years. And I think that's incredibly important. But I also think it's super important that the junior levels then hear that their voice are being heard, right? That they're getting that time. I think it helps with engagement. And I think it really just helps with that whole commitment to actually an inclusive culture. So for me, mentoring very much is both ways, right? And I think what I've certainly seen in my career is a step change in the reverse mentoring piece in recent years. And I think that's a hugely positive move.
So can you give any examples, perhaps personal examples from your mentorship journey of either the impact that mentoring has had on you, and I guess also the impact that you as a mentor have had on other, rising stars and emerging leaders within your bank, or perhaps also the impact that reverse mentoring has had within your organization that's actually helped create change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess if we start personal reflections on some of the mentors that I've had, and I think, look, it's a well-cited fact around females typically do doubt when they go ahead for that next step, whether it be a lateral move or whether it be that step up around, they often look at, these are 10 reasons why I shouldn't do the role rather than why I should.
Yeah.
And one of, a great mentor that I had a few years back said to me, Rita, you have to recognize that when you go for a role, the people that are, have invited you to interview, have reviewed your CV, or know through advocacy throughout the bank or the organization, actually want you there for a reason, right? Everyone appreciates that there'll be gaps and that there's growth. And that really resonated with me, because I think for the first time ever, I thought, right, I don't have to be perfect on everything. I bring something, and in individuals, we all bring something to the table, and recognizing that having those gaps is natural, and everyone does have them. And at no point should we stop learning, right? So I think that really helped me with my thought process and with moving ahead to some of the roles that I've gone into. I think if I look at working where I've mentored others, what's been wonderful for me in a few instances is actually see the progression of those individuals. What I think is super important when you look at mentorship, and this is both ways. One, being authentic, right? Being open and honest. And at times that requires challenging conversations and just true reflection, I think, on both parts. And I think that's important to set the scene at the offset to actually make sure that that mentor relationship works. But once you have that then, and the commitment on both sides, you have an individual, a mentee, who is really committed and open to making changes or stepping out of their comfort zone. And then equally, as a mentor, you have the responsibility actually to give them the platform to do so, and to enable them actually to get varied experience, whether that be something as, small, if you like, as just giving them work experience in different areas, or connecting them, or using your network actually to broaden their network. But actually seeing that come through then, when you have that mixture of commitment on both sides, is incredible. And for me, that's fundamentally the best part of the people that I've mentored. And then I think on the reverse mentorship piece, we've got tons of examples at Lloyds of where it's worked incredibly well. I'm very proud of the organisation, have really, really stood behind this and seen the benefit of it. Personally, what it's really helped me, certainly as I've moved into leadership roles, is truly understanding the team that work for me, and the differences. And I go back sometimes to that generational point. The way I would approach things are very different naturally anyway, right? As humans, we're very, very different. But actually, approach to tech. So I've learned a lot through tech, and, my team would laugh at it, but it's true. Through that insight and through that reverse mentorship, it also helps really build and cement relationships. So I think there's huge benefit to it. And it is key, in my mind, that cultural shift around engagement, inclusivity, as well as providing that platform for talent to come through.
Thank you very much, Rita. And I guess, what can organisations outside of Lloyds Bank do? Let's say large trade associations, other trade bodies do to actually accelerate and share some of those best practices? Because, I think it's fair to say that in the UK, it's in a fairly good place when it comes to the gender gap and gender diversity, when you compare that in many other regions around the world, in Africa, even in the US, in many countries in Asia, there is a pronounced and much bigger gender gap. So what can some of these larger organisations do to lead by example?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's actually something that I think, the industry, I'm delighted to say, is really leaning into. So BAFT recently launched, back in May, at their annual general meeting, a new Women in Transaction Banking. And I'm delighted to say I'm part of the council of that. And this is a global network across FIs globally. And the whole ethos and reason for being is to provide that network and platform for individuals in transaction banking, for women in transaction banking across different regions, to have networking opportunities, to learn from one another's experience, to have speaker opportunities. And I think that's fascinating, actually, because in the meetings we've had so far, including the launch breakfast at the annual general meeting at BAFT in Orlando, just sharing, to your point exactly, those experiences. Some of the people I was speaking to in the US or, in different jurisdictions had such a very different experience than what we're seeing in the UK. So I think there's tons of value in that. And it's really wonderful to see the industry step behind it.
So sharing stories and letting the industry kind of provide, the industry associations perhaps providing that platform.
Yeah, so I think that's important as a basis. I think the key then on top of that really is measuring success, right?
Yep.
Because it's great to create that engagement, and that's fundamental in the first instance, but actually how do we know it's having an impact,
Yep.
right? So what does success look like? What are the key milestones? I know as a council, something we're looking at, what will be our KPIs?
Yep.
What are we going to track? How are we going to assess to make sure actually that as we evolve and develop, we're taking on feedback, we're taking on the experience of the females within our network and the wider allies, to really grow, right, and to continue growing this and developing.
Well, I want to pick up on your point about allies, and I guess you're talking about men. What can men do to drive this change? Because I'm going to assume that there'll be more men watching this video than women, just due to the virtue of what the current gender status looks like in our industry. So what can allies like men do?
So allyship, I think, is paramount, right, to any success we're going to have here around rebalancing the diverse agenda, full stop, right? Because everyone has to take responsibility for this. So I think that is just super important. And I think it's one of the things actually that we should demystify at the start, because often that's not taken account of, in my opinion. So super important to say that. I think if I look at what we've got in Lloyds Banking Group, our Women Employee Network, which has a lot of allies as well, Breakthrough, I'm delighted to say is one of the largest in the UK. So we have 10,000 or so members, 4,000 mentors. And I think if we look at what an organisation can do, that's a great example actually of how we can really support colleagues in fulfilling their career aspirations and giving them that network to do so. But again, I go back to that opening point. It's joint responsibility, right? Everyone needs to be responsible for driving this change.
So you say joint responsibility, and I guess there is a traditional value sometimes of the paternal versus the maternal role, especially in things like family life. And what would you say employers should prioritize when it actually comes to supporting women in establishing, say, sustainable work or family balance?
So I think there's a number of different aspects to that, certainly, and I think this applies across the piece, but as we live in a post-COVID world where hybrid working, particularly in the banking space, is much more widely adopted, that is a game changer. And a lot of not only female colleagues, a lot of the colleagues that I speak to get value through that, whether they have caring responsibilities or it just helps with that general work-life balance. So I do think that's important. I think the other thing, and it goes back to being a role model and being an authentic role model in sharing one's experience, right? I sit here as a mother of 2 young children, and I'm constantly trying to get that balance, right? There is no, I don't think, panacea of things. Some days work really well. Others, that's just the way it is, right? And you start again. But I think it's super important to be open and honest about that, to demystify it. I've certainly throughout my career balanced that work-life balance, and it changes, right? As work changes, as home life changes. So being dynamic in that, and then having a network around you, actually just to feed off one another's experiences, to know you're not alone, I think is really, understated. It's hugely important actually, to know that others go through this as well. But also, and I think more fundamentally, providing others with access to building the same network, right? So as they develop through their careers, they've got that network that they can work and lean on.
Thank you very much, Rita. And one final question, and I want to ask, I'm sure there are lots of aspiring, emerging female leaders who will be watching this video. I want to ask you, one tip you would give to them as an aspiring leader, mentor, and mother. So I would say absolutely believe in yourself, right? And always think, back to that point when you're going forward for something, think of the experience, the qualities that you bring, and take confidence in that. But also realize that we're all still learning as well, right? And as we build out and as we move the dial on gender, on diversity, actually those networks will broaden. So absolutely, there's support out there. Thank you very much. That was Rita King, at Lloyds Bank here at Cybos Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you.